The scream came from the west hallway of Blackmore Palace, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet evening air like a blade. Elena Marsh froze at the edge of the training yard, her basket of herbs slipping from her fingers and spilling onto the stone path. She had only come to deliver medicine to her aunt, who worked in the kitchens, but now guards were running past her, their boots pounding against the ground, their faces pale with fear. "Move aside," one of them barked, pushing past her without a second glance. Elena pressed herself against the cold stone wall, her heart hammering. She was not supposed to be here. Ordinary villagers like her were never allowed near the palace grounds, let alone inside them. Her aunt had begged her to bring the fever medicine before nightfall, and Elena had not wanted to say no. Now she wished she had. A young boy, no older than 10, was carried past her on a guard's shoulders, his small body limp, his skin far too pale. Elena recognized him instantly. Everyone in the kingdom knew the boy's face from the coins that carried his family's crest. He was Caden, the king's nephew, the only child left in the royal bloodline besides the king himself. "He's not breathing right," someone shouted. "Get the healer. Where is the healer?" "The healer left for the eastern village 3 days ago," another voice answered, panic rising. "There's no one here who can help him in time." Elena's feet moved before her mind caught up with them. She had spent years at her mother's side, learning the old ways of healing, the ways that came from herbs and steady hands rather than expensive palace medicine. She had treated fevers like this before, fevers that came fast and dangerous, the kind that could take a life in a single night if left untreated. "Wait," she called out, stepping into the hallway despite every instinct telling her to run the other way. "I can help him." The guards turned to look at her, as if she had lost her mind. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his jaw, stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Who are you?" "No one is allowed in this hallway." "My name is Elena Marsh. My mother is a healer. I know what this sickness is. It's swelling of the throat, brought on by bad water. If you don't act now, he won't survive the hour." The guard hesitated, torn between the rules of the palace and the boy dying in his arms. Before he could decide, a voice cut through the chaos, low and commanding, a voice that made every guard in the hallway straighten immediately. "Let her through." Elena turned toward the sound and felt the air leave her lungs. Standing at the end of the hallway was a man who needed no introduction, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black clothing that seemed to absorb the light around him. King Ashbourne Draven looked exactly like the stories described him, cold eyes, a face carved from stone, a presence that filled the entire hallway before he even took a step. Elena had heard about him her entire life. Every woman in the kingdom had. He was the Alpha King, ruler of Blackmore, a man whose first wife had died under circumstances no one dared speak of openly. The stories varied depending on who told them, but they all ended the same way. The old queen was gone, and the king had never taken another wife, never even looked twice at another woman since. Mothers warned their daughters never to catch his attention. Fathers kept their families far from the palace during royal gatherings. The fear surrounding him had become so deep that it no longer needed proof. It simply existed, passed down like an old family recipe, stirred into every conversation about the crown. And now Elena stood only a few steps away from him, close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the barely controlled fear hidden beneath his calm expression. "You said you can help him," Ashbourne said, his voice steady despite the situation. "Prove it. Now." Elena swallowed hard and nodded. She could think about her fear later. Right now, a child's life was slipping away. "I need hot water, clean cloth and salt," she said, moving toward the boy. "And I need someone to hold him still. His throat is closing. If we don't open his airway safely, he'll lose consciousness." The guards scrambled to follow her instructions, and within moments, Elena knelt beside Caden, tilting his head back gently, checking the color of his lips, the rhythm of his breath. She had seen this exact sickness twice before in her village. Both times, quick action had saved the patient. She prayed silently that this time would be no different. "Hold his shoulders," she instructed one of the guards. "Don't let him move." She worked quickly, mixing salt into warm water, using a thin cloth to clear his airway, with careful, practiced movements. The boy coughed weakly, his small chest rising and falling with more effort than it should. Elena kept talking to him softly, telling him he was safe, that he needed to breathe slowly, that everything would be fine, even though she wasn't entirely certain herself. Minutes passed like hours. The hallway had gone completely silent except for the sound of Caden's breathing, gradually growing steadier, gradually growing stronger. When his eyes finally fluttered open, weak but alert, a collective breath of relief passed through everyone in the hallway. "There you are," Elena whispered, brushing damp hair from the boy's forehead. "You're going to be fine now." She looked up, expecting relief on the faces around her, but instead, she found something else entirely. Every guard, every servant standing nearby, was staring at her with a mixture of shock and disbelief, as if they could not process what they had just witnessed. And standing closest to her, watching with an unreadable expression, was the king himself. Ashbourne had not moved from where he stood the entire time. His eyes had followed every motion of her hands, every word she spoke to his nephew, with an intensity that made Elena's skin prickle even now that the crisis had passed. "You saved his life," Ashbourne said finally, his voice quieter now, though no less commanding. "I only did what any healer would do, Your Majesty," Elena said, rising to her feet and bowing quickly, suddenly remembering exactly who she was standing in front of. "I'm glad I was here to help." Ashbourne studied her for a long moment, long enough that Elena began to feel uncomfortable under his gaze. She had heard the stories about his eyes, how they seemed to look straight through a person, how no one could hold his stare for more than a few seconds without looking away. She understood now why people said that. There was something in his expression that felt like it was searching for something, though she couldn't guess what. "What is your name again?" he asked. "Elena Marsh, Your Majesty." "And you learned healing from your mother?" "Yes, Your Majesty. She has treated our village for over 20 years. Ashbourne nodded slowly, then turned to the guard who had first stopped Elena in the hallway. "Where is our royal healer now?" "Traveling to the eastern village, Your Majesty. He left 3 days ago, and is not expected back for another week." "Then we have no one qualified to care for the household in his absence." The guard shifted uncomfortably. "That is correct, Your Majesty." Ashbourne turned back to Elena, and something in his expression shifted, though Elena couldn't quite name what it was. Calculation, perhaps, or curiosity. "You will stay at the palace until our healer returns," he said. "It was not a request. You will care for my nephew, and anyone else in the household who requires attention. You will be compensated fairly for your time." Elena's mouth went dry. Stay at the palace? With him? Every warning her mother had ever given her about the royal family rushed back into her mind at once. Stay away from the palace, Elena. Stay away from him especially. Men like that bring nothing but ruin to women like us. "Your Majesty, I appreciate the offer, but my family needs me at home. My father's health has not been well, and—" "I said you will stay," Ashbourne interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument, though something flickered across his face, something almost like guilt at his own sharpness. "Your family will be compensated as well. Whatever debts you carry, whatever hardship you face, it will be resolved. This is not a punishment, Elena Marsh. This is a position of importance." Elena wanted to argue further, but she knew there was no winning against a king, especially not this one. And the truth was, her family did need the money. Her father's illness had drained what little savings they had, and the promise of steady payment from the crown was not something she could simply refuse, no matter how much fear coiled in her stomach at the thought of staying under this roof. "Yes, Your Majesty," she said quietly, bowing her head. "I will stay." "Good." Ashbourne turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at her one more time. "Thank you for saving my nephew's life." The words were simple, but something about the way he said them, low and almost hesitant, made Elena realize that whatever reputation followed this man through every corner of the kingdom, there was more to him than the stories claimed. Or perhaps she was simply naive, seeing kindness where there was none, the way a mouse might mistake a snake's stillness for peace. As the guards led her toward the servant quarters where she would be staying, Elena caught sight of a woman standing at the far end of the hallway, watching the entire scene unfold with narrowed eyes. She was elegant, dressed in fine fabrics that marked her as someone of noble status, her expression unreadable except for the sharp, calculating look she gave Elena, before turning and disappearing down another corridor. Elena did not know who that woman was, but the chill that ran down her spine told her she had just made an enemy, without saying a single word. That night, lying in the small but comfortable room she had been given within the palace walls, Elena stared up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Somewhere in this same building, the king who every woman feared was resting behind closed doors, carrying secrets that no one dared ask about directly. And now she was tangled in his world, whether she wanted to be or not. She thought about the stories she had grown up hearing, whispered around fires and market stalls. The old queen, Seraphine, had died mysteriously years ago, and no one ever spoke of the details. Some said the king had grown cold and cruel after losing her. Others said he was the reason she was gone in the first place, though no one could say exactly how or why. The fear surrounding him had grown so large over the years that it had become impossible to separate truth from rumor. Elena did not know which stories were real, but she knew one thing for certain. She had just agreed to spend the next several days, perhaps longer, living under the same roof as a man the entire kingdom feared, and there was no way to know yet whether that fear was justified or simply the product of years of silence and unanswered questions. Outside her window, the moon hung low over the palace grounds, casting long shadows across the courtyard below. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its cry echoing through the night like a warning. Elena closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Tomorrow, she would begin her work as the temporary healer of Blackmore Palace. Tomorrow, she would see the king again, and this time, there would be no crisis to distract either of them from the questions hanging heavy in the air between them. She had no way of knowing that this single night would change the entire course of her life, that the fear she carried into this palace would slowly transform into something far more complicated, something that would eventually challenge everything the kingdom believed about its king, about its history, and about the terrible secret that had been buried for years beneath the palace's cold stone walls. For now, she simply closed her eyes and waited for morning, unaware that somewhere in the palace, the king was standing at his window too, staring out at the same moon, thinking about the woman who had looked him in the eye without flinching, something no one had done in a very long time. Morning arrived at Blackmore Palace, with a gray mist rolling over the courtyard, and Elena woke earlier than she intended, her body still adjusting to the unfamiliar softness of the bed and the strange silence of a room that was not her own. She dressed quickly in the simple healer's clothing that had been left for her the night before, tied her dark hair back, and made her way toward the kitchens, following the scent of fresh bread and the sound of clattering pots. A young servant girl, named Ivy, greeted her at the kitchen door, her eyes wide with curiosity. "You're the one who saved the young master, aren't you? Everyone's talking about it." "I only did what needed to be done," Elena said, accepting a small bowl of porridge that Ivy offered her. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. Caden is already asking for you. He wants to thank you properly, or so I heard from one of the guards." Ivy leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "But be careful. Lady Mirren has been asking questions about you all morning." Elena's stomach tightened at the mention of the name, though she did not recognize it. "Who is Lady Mirren?" Ivy glanced around before answering, as if the walls themselves might carry the words back to someone dangerous. "She's a noblewoman, close to the king's late wife, Queen Seraphine. She's stayed at the palace ever since the queen passed, helping manage the household affairs. Some say she hoped to become queen herself one day, though the king has never shown interest in anyone since Seraphine died." Ivy paused, glancing toward the doorway before adding, "She doesn't like new faces around the king, especially not ones he seems to notice." Elena thought of the elegant woman she had seen watching her in the hallway the night before, the sharp, calculating look in her eyes. That must have been Lady Mirren. "I'm not trying to draw the king's attention," Elena said carefully. "I'm only here until the royal healer returns." Ivy gave her a knowing smile that suggested she didn't quite believe that would be so simple, but she said nothing more, before hurrying off to attend to her other duties. After finishing her breakfast, Elena was led to the young prince's chambers, where Caden sat propped up against a mountain of pillows, looking remarkably better than he had the previous evening. His color had returned, and his eyes were bright with the kind of energy only children seem to recover so quickly. "You're the one who saved me," he said, the moment Elena entered the room, his voice filled with the bluntness only children possessed. "I helped, yes," Elena said, smiling despite herself as she moved to check his pulse and the color beneath his eyes. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Much better. My throat still hurts a little, but I can breathe fine now." He studied her with open curiosity. Uncle Ashbourne hasn't let anyone else near me since last night. He made the guards stand outside my door all night. Elena paused, surprised by this detail. That's very protective of him. He's always protective, especially since I'm all he has left. Caden's expression grew somber for a moment, older than his years. My parents died when I was small. Uncle Ashbourne raised me himself, even though a king isn't supposed to do things like that. Everyone says he should have hired someone else, but he never did. Elena said nothing, but she filed this piece of information away carefully. The stories about the king painted him as cold, distant, dangerous even. But a man who personally raised his orphaned nephew, who stood guard outside a sick room all night, did not fit easily into that image. "Do you know what happened to the old queen?" Elena asked, before she could stop herself, immediately regretting the question the moment it left her lips. Caden's face changed, the openness disappearing behind something more guarded. "Nobody talks about that. Uncle Ashbourne gets very quiet whenever her name comes up. I don't really remember her much. I was very young when she died." "I'm sorry," Elena said quickly. "I shouldn't have asked." "It's all right. Everyone wants to know eventually." Caden shrugged, though his small shoulders carried the weight of the words. "I just wish people would ask him, instead of whispering about it behind his back." Elena finished her examination in silence, promising to check on him again later in the day, and left the room with far more questions than she had entered with. She had come to this palace expecting fear and danger, and instead she was finding fragments of a story that did not match the rumors at all. Her path through the palace corridors led her toward the herb garden, where she hoped to gather supplies for a fever tonic she wanted to prepare for the kitchen staff, several of whom had come down with minor colds. She was halfway through selecting the right leaves, when a shadow fell across the garden path, and she looked up to find the king standing several feet away, watching her with the same intense, unreadable expression from the night before. "Your Majesty," Elena said, quickly straightening and offering a proper bow. "I didn't hear you approach." "Most people don't," Ashbourne said simply, moving closer, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that seemed almost formal despite the informality of the garden setting. "How is my nephew this morning?" "Recovering well. His fever has broken, and his breathing has returned to normal. He should make a full recovery within a few days, though I'd recommend keeping him away from strenuous activity until then." Ashbourne nodded, some of the tension in his shoulders easing slightly at this news. "You have my gratitude, Elena Marsh. I do not say this lightly. Few things frighten me, but the thought of losing him was one of them." The admission surprised her, coming from a man whose entire reputation was built on fear rather than vulnerability. Elena studied him for a moment, trying to reconcile the stories she had grown up with against the man standing in front of her, a man who spoke of fear so openly, who had personally cared for an orphaned child, who now stood in a garden discussing herbs with a healer, instead of issuing commands from a throne. "May I ask you something, Your Majesty?" Elena said, surprising herself with her own boldness. Ashbourne's eyebrows lifted slightly, as if he too were surprised by her directness. Most people, she imagined, did not ask this man questions. They simply waited to be told things, or they avoided him entirely. "You may ask. I cannot promise I will answer." "Why does everyone fear you so much?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than Elena had anticipated once it left her mouth. She watched something flicker across Ashbourne's face, a complicated mixture of emotions that came and went too quickly for her to name any single one of them. Surprise, certainly. Perhaps something like old, worn pain beneath it. "That is a very direct question," he said finally. "I apologize if it was too forward." "No," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I find I prefer directness to whispers behind my back. At least directness can be answered honestly." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the palace walls, as if searching for the right words somewhere within the stone. "People fear what they do not understand, Elena Marsh. And there are things about my past that I have never explained to anyone, things that have been left to rumor and speculation for years. It is easier, in some ways, to let people believe whatever story frightens them most, than to relive certain memories by correcting them. Even if the stories aren't true? Especially then." His eyes met hers, and for a moment, Elena saw something raw beneath the composed exterior he wore like armor. "Truth is a complicated thing, Elena. Sometimes it hurts more than the lies people tell in its place. Elena wanted to press further, to ask about Seraphine directly, about the whispers of what had truly happened to the old queen, but something in Ashbourne's expression told her this was not the moment. Whatever pain lived behind his eyes was not ready to be examined by a stranger he had known for less than a day, however capable she had proven herself to be. "I should return to my duties," Elena said instead, gathering the herbs she had collected. "Thank you for speaking with me, Your Majesty." "Ashbourne," he said suddenly, before she could turn away. Elena blinked. "Your Majesty? You may call me Ashbourne, at least when we are not in front of the court." He seemed almost surprised by his own words, as if he hadn't planned to say them, but he did not take them back. Formality feels unnecessary between two people who spent last night saving a child's life together. Elena hesitated, unsure how to respond to such an offer from a king. "Very well, Ashbourne." Something almost like the ghost of a smile crossed his face before he composed himself again, nodding once, and turning to walk back toward the palace, leaving Elena alone in the garden, with her basket of herbs, and a growing sense that everything she thought she understood about this man, about this place, was about to be completely rewritten. As she watched him disappear through the palace doors, she did not notice Lady Mirren watching the entire exchange from an upstairs window, her fingers tightening around the curtain fabric until her knuckles turned white, her expression twisted into something far darker than simple curiosity. The garden was peaceful, the morning sun beginning to burn away the last of the mist, but somewhere within those palace walls, old secrets were beginning to stir, disturbed for the first time in years by the presence of a healer's daughter who refused to be afraid. Days passed at Blackmore Palace, and Elena found herself settling into a routine she had never expected to feel comfortable with. Mornings were spent tending to Caden and the handful of servants who came to her with minor ailments. Afternoons were spent restocking the palace's small store of herbs and remedies, and evenings, more often than not, ended with a quiet conversation, somewhere within the palace grounds with the king himself. She told herself these meetings meant nothing, that they were simply the natural result of two people occupying the same space, day after day. But she could not deny the way her heart quickened whenever she caught sight of him walking the corridors, nor the way his expression seemed to soften, just slightly, whenever their eyes met. It was during one such evening, as Elena organized dried herbs in the small room set aside for her work, that she came across something unexpected. Tucked behind a shelf of old glass jars, half hidden beneath a layer of dust, was a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Elena hesitated, knowing she likely shouldn't touch something that clearly did not belong to her, but curiosity won out over caution, and she carefully opened the cover. The handwriting inside was elegant, feminine, and the first page bore a single name written in careful script: Seraphine. Elena's breath caught. This was the old queen's personal journal, somehow left behind in this small storage room for years, forgotten or perhaps hidden deliberately by someone who did not want it found. She knew she should put it back immediately, that reading a dead woman's private thoughts was not something she had any right to do, but her eyes had already caught fragments of sentences on the open page, words that sent a chill down her spine despite the warmth of the evening. "I fear I am not safe within these walls, though I dare not say this to Ashbourne. He would tear the palace apart searching for whoever threatens me, and I cannot risk what that search might uncover about the true nature of my fear. It is closer than he realizes, closer than anyone realizes." Elena's hands trembled as she turned to another page, her healer's instincts telling her that whatever secrets this journal held were far more dangerous than simple palace gossip. "Mirren grows more desperate by the day. I have tried to be kind to her, to understand her jealousy, but I fear kindness alone will not be enough to protect me from what she is capable of. If anything should happen to me, I pray someone finds this journal and understands the truth, rather than believing whatever story is told in its place." Elena closed the journal slowly, her mind racing. If these words were true, then Seraphine had feared for her life before her death, and she had specifically named Lady Mirren as the source of that fear. This was not simply idle speculation or rumor passed down through years of gossip. This was written proof from the Queen's own hand. But proof of what, exactly? The journal did not explicitly say that Mirren had caused Seraphine's death. It only suggested fear, suspicion, a sense of danger that the Queen had never fully explained, even in her most private writings. Elena knew she needed to think carefully about what to do with this discovery. If she brought it directly to Ashbourne, she risked reopening wounds that had clearly never fully healed, wounds that colored every interaction he had with the world around him. But if she said nothing, and Lady Mirren truly was dangerous, then keeping silent might put her own safety, and perhaps others, at risk. She decided, for now, to keep the journal hidden among her own belongings, wanting to read through its remaining pages before deciding what to do with the information it contained. Whatever had happened to Seraphine, whatever secrets this palace had buried alongside its old queen, Elena felt a growing certainty that she was meant to uncover them, whether that had been her intention when she first walked through these gates or not. That night, sleep proved difficult once again. Every creak of the old palace walls, every distant sound in the corridors outside her room, made her sit up sharply, her mind replaying the words she had read. She thought of Lady Mirren's cold, calculating stare from that first night, the way her eyes had followed Elena's every movement, with something far darker than simple curiosity. The following morning, Elena nearly walked directly into Lady Mirren herself, while carrying a tray of morning tonics toward the kitchen. The noblewoman stood in the hallway, as if she had been waiting there deliberately, her expression carefully composed into something pleasant, though her eyes remained as sharp and cold as Elena remembered. "Elena Marsh," Mirren said, her voice smooth as silk. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "Lady Mirren," Elena replied carefully, offering a small bow. "I hope I haven't caused any trouble by staying at the palace." "Trouble? Of course not." Mirren's smile did not reach her eyes. "Though I must say, it's quite unusual for the king to take such a personal interest in a village healer. He's not typically one for socializing, especially not with women. I imagine you must feel very special." The comment carried an edge beneath its polite surface, a warning disguised as casual conversation. Elena chose her words carefully, aware that she was walking through dangerous territory, without fully understanding the rules of this particular game. "I only came to help his nephew, my lady. I have no interest in anything beyond my duties as healer." "How wise of you." Mirren stepped closer, her voice dropping lower, though the pleasant smile remained fixed in place like a mask. "You should know, Elena Marsh, that many women have believed they were different, that they might succeed where others failed. None of them lasted very long within these walls. I would hate to see something unfortunate happen to a girl with such promising skills." The threat was unmistakable now, wrapped in polite phrasing, but sharp as a blade nonetheless. Elena felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to let her fear show on her face. She had faced dying children and desperate villagers with steady hands before. She would not let this woman see her tremble. "I appreciate the warning, my lady," Elena said evenly. "I intend only to fulfill my duties until the royal healer returns. Nothing more." Mirren studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether Elena was being truthful or simply clever enough to hide her true intentions. Finally, she offered a thin smile and stepped aside, allowing Elena to pass. "See that it stays that way," she said quietly, as Elena walked past her, the words following her down the corridor, like a shadow that refused to release its hold. Elena did not slow her pace until she reached the kitchen, setting down her tray with hands that trembled more than she wanted to admit. Ivy noticed immediately, her eyes widening with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Ivy said, hurrying over. "What happened?" "I ran into Lady Mirren," Elena said quietly. Ivy's expression darkened instantly. "What did she say to you?" "She warned me to keep my distance from the king. She implied that other women who tried to get close to him didn't fare well." Elena paused, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Ivy, do you know anything about how the old queen actually died? Not the rumors, but anything real?" Ivy's face went pale, and she lowered her voice to barely above a whisper. "I was only a young girl working in the kitchens when it happened, but I remember the night clearly. There was a lot of shouting, a lot of chaos. The official story was that Queen Seraphine fell ill suddenly and passed within days. But," she trailed off, glancing nervously toward the doorway. "But what?" Elena pressed gently. "But some of the older servants always said the illness came on too fast to be natural. And Lady Mirren was the one who prepared the queen's meals and medicine during those final days. Since she claimed to have knowledge of herbal remedies herself, no one ever questioned it publicly, because questioning the nobility gets servants dismissed, or worse. But there were whispers, even back then. Elena's mind raced, connecting Ivy's account with the fearful words she had read in Seraphine's journal the night before. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, though it remained incomplete, full of gaps and uncertainties that she did not yet have enough information to fill. "Please don't repeat what I've told you to anyone," Ivy said suddenly, gripping Elena's arm. "If Lady Mirren ever found out I said any of this, I don't know what she might do." "I promise," Elena said, squeezing Ivy's hand reassuringly, though inside her own thoughts churned with uncertainty and growing suspicion. As she returned to her duties for the day, Elena found herself glancing over her shoulder more frequently than usual, aware now that she had stepped into something far more dangerous than she had realized when she first agreed to stay within these palace walls. The king's cold reputation, the fear that surrounded him throughout the kingdom, suddenly seemed less like the truth and more like a carefully constructed shield, built perhaps not by Ashbourne himself, but by someone who benefited greatly from his isolation, from the world believing him a monster, rather than looking closer at what had truly happened to the woman he once loved. Elena did not yet know how deep this mystery ran, nor how dangerous it might become before she found her answers, but she knew, with growing certainty, that she could not simply walk away now, not when a dead queen's final words had all but named her killer, and not when the king who wore fear like armor deserved to know the truth that had been hidden from him for years. A week passed since Elena had discovered Seraphine's journal, and though she had read every page multiple times by now, searching for clearer answers, the entries remained frustratingly vague about the exact nature of the danger the old queen had feared. What was clear, however, was the growing tension within the palace walls, a tension that seemed to tighten with each passing day, as Lady Mirren's watchful presence became harder and harder to ignore. Elena had taken to keeping the journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room, wrapped carefully in cloth, terrified of what might happen should anyone discover she possessed it. She had not yet decided whether to bring it to Ashbourne, still uncertain whether the pain of reopening old wounds would outweigh the value of whatever truth lay buried within those pages. Her days continued much as before, tending to the household's health needs, gathering herbs from the garden, and finding herself, more often than she cared to admit, drawn into quiet conversations with the king during the evening hours. Their exchanges had grown easier over time, the initial tension between them softening into something that felt almost like genuine friendship, though Elena knew better than to name it anything more than that, not yet, not when so much uncertainty still hung over everything. One evening, as autumn winds began sweeping through the palace grounds, carrying the first cold bite of the coming season, Elena found Ashbourne standing alone on one of the palace balconies, staring out at the darkening sky, with an expression she had not seen on him before. Something heavier than his usual guarded composure weighed on his features, something that looked almost like grief. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly, approaching carefully, not wanting to intrude if he wished to be left alone. Ashbourne glanced at her, and for a moment, she saw something raw flicker across his face before he composed himself again. "Today marks the anniversary of Seraphine's death," he said quietly. 5 years now." Elena's heart clenched at the confirmation, at the weight in his voice as he spoke the words. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "That must be difficult to carry, especially alone." "I have carried it alone for 5 years," he admitted, turning his gaze back toward the darkening horizon. "No one asks about her anymore. No one dares mention her name in my presence, as if speaking it might shatter something fragile within me. Sometimes I wonder if people believe I have simply forgotten her, moved past the grief entirely." "Have you?" Elena asked carefully. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I think about her every single day. I think about what I could have done differently, what I might have noticed if I had been paying closer attention. She was unwell in her final weeks, exhausted, frightened of something she never fully explained to me, and I was too consumed with the responsibilities of ruling this kingdom to see what was happening right in front of me." Elena's pulse quickened at his words, echoing so closely the fear Seraphine had written about in her own private pages. She hesitated, torn between wanting to comfort him and wanting to press further into the mystery that continued to grow more complicated with each new piece of information. "What do you mean, frightened of something?" she asked carefully. Ashbourne's expression grew distant, as if he were pulling memories from somewhere deep and painful. "In the weeks before she died, Seraphine grew withdrawn. She stopped eating properly, claimed she wasn't feeling well, though our physicians could find nothing wrong with her. She would flinch at sudden sounds, grow anxious whenever certain members of the court entered the room. I asked her repeatedly what troubled her, but she always insisted it was nothing, that she didn't want to worry me unnecessarily. And then she died, Elena said softly. Suddenly. Within days of her condition worsening. The physicians called it a wasting sickness, something that simply took hold of her body and refused to release its grip. I have spent 5 years believing that explanation, though a part of me has always wondered if there was more to the story than what I was told. He turned to look at Elena directly, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Why do you ask about this now, Elena? You've never pressed me on the details before. Elena's heart pounded as she weighed her options. She could continue avoiding the truth, protecting Ashbourne from pain that might serve no purpose beyond reopening old wounds. Or she could tell him what she had found, what she suspected, and risk the consequences of whatever truth lay hidden beneath years of careful silence. She chose honesty. I found something, she said quietly, in the storage room where I keep my herbs. A journal that belonged to Seraphine. Ashbourne went completely still, his expression unreadable in the fading evening light. A journal, he repeated slowly. I should have brought it to you immediately, and I apologize for not doing so sooner. I wasn't certain how to approach the subject, or whether it would cause more harm than good. Elena reached into the pocket of her healer's apron, where she had begun carrying the small journal with her each day, uncertain of when the right moment to reveal it might come. She held it out to him now, her hands trembling slightly. I think you should read it yourself. Ashbourne stared at the journal for a long moment before taking it from her hands, his fingers brushing against hers briefly, sending an unexpected warmth through her, despite the cold evening air. He opened the cover carefully, and Elena watched as recognition and pain crossed his features simultaneously at the sight of his late wife's handwriting. Where did you find this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tucked behind some old glass jars in the storage room, it looked as though it had been hidden there deliberately, or perhaps forgotten during some chaotic moment. I don't know how long it had been sitting there before I discovered it. Ashbourne's eyes moved across the pages, and Elena watched his expression shift from grief to confusion to something sharper, something that looked almost like anger, though not directed at her. When he finally looked up, his jaw was tight, his eyes darker than she had ever seen them. She feared for her life, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. She wrote here that she feared for her safety, and I never knew. I never suspected. I believe she was trying to protect you from whatever was happening, Elena said gently. Perhaps she thought that if she told you directly, you might act in a way that would put you both in greater danger. Ashbourne's gaze dropped back to the page, his eyes tracing over Mirren's name written in his late wife's careful script. She names Mirren here, he said slowly, as if the words were difficult to process, even as he spoke them aloud. She writes that Mirren's jealousy frightened her, that she feared what Mirren might be capable of. I noticed that as well, Elena admitted. Mirren has been part of this household since before Seraphine and I were married. She was one of Seraphine's closest companions, or so I always believed. Ashbourne's voice grew harder, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the balcony railing. I never once suspected her of anything beyond loyalty to my late wife. If what this journal suggests is true, if Mirren played any role in Seraphine's death, I have been allowing her to remain within these walls, trusted with the management of my household, for 5 years. Elena watched the storm building behind his eyes, the barely contained fury that seemed to be warring against years of careful, controlled composure. She understood now, more clearly than ever, why the entire kingdom feared this man. Beneath his calm exterior lived a depth of emotion, capable of tremendous force, capable of shaking the very foundations of the world around him, should it ever be fully released. We don't know for certain what happened, Elena said carefully, placing a gentle hand on his arm, feeling him tense beneath her touch, before slowly relaxing. The journal expresses fear and suspicion, but it doesn't provide proof of anything concrete. We need to be careful before making any accusations, especially against someone of Lady Mirren's standing within the court. Ashbourne's jaw remained tight, but he nodded slowly, some of the fire in his eyes dimming into something more controlled, more calculated. You're right, of course. Accusations without proof would only create chaos within the court, and Mirren has powerful allies among the nobility who would not take kindly to baseless claims against her, regardless of what evidence we might present. He closed the journal carefully, holding it as though it were something precious and fragile. But I intend to find that proof, Elena. Whatever happened to Seraphine, whoever is responsible, I will not rest until I know the complete truth. I'll help you, Elena said without hesitation. Whatever I can do, whatever I've already noticed during my time here, I'll share it with you. Ashbourne's expression softened as he looked at her, something warm replacing the anger that had consumed his features moments before. Why would you involve yourself in something so dangerous, Elena? You have no obligation to me beyond your temporary duties as healer. This is not your burden to carry. Elena considered the question carefully before answering, surprised by the honesty of her own response. Because someone deserves to know the truth about what happened to their wife. Because a woman who feared for her life deserves justice, even 5 years after her death. And because... She hesitated, uncertain whether to voice the rest of her thought. Because? Ashbourne prompted gently. Because I've come to care about what happens to you, Elena admitted quietly, her cheeks warming despite the cold evening air. More than I expected to, given how little time we've actually known each other. Ashbourne was silent for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse race. Then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand in his touch gentle despite the strength she knew lived within him. I have not allowed myself to care about anyone in this way since Seraphine died, he said quietly. I convinced myself it was safer that way, easier to bear the weight of this crown, without additional attachments that might one day be taken from me. But these past days with you, Elena, have made me question whether that isolation has served me at all, or whether it has simply been another form of grief I refuse to acknowledge. Elena's heart pounded as she looked up at him, the weight of his words settling over her like a warm blanket against the cold evening air. Whatever fear had brought her to this palace weeks ago felt distant now, replaced by something far more complicated, something that felt dangerously close to hope. But even as they stood together on that balcony, unaware of the danger gathering just beyond their sight, Lady Mirren watched from a darkened window nearby, her eyes fixed on the journal, now safely in the king's possession, her expression twisting into something cold and calculating, as she realized that her carefully constructed secrets were beginning, at last, to unravel. News traveled fast through the palace, even news that was meant to remain private, and within 2 days of Ashbourne reading Seraphine's journal, whispers had begun circulating among the household staff that something significant had changed within the royal family's private affairs. Elena noticed the shift immediately, the way servants exchanged nervous glances whenever Lady Mirren passed through a room, the way conversations halted abruptly whenever the noblewoman's name arose. Ashbourne had not yet confronted Mirren directly, choosing instead to move carefully, gathering whatever additional information he could before making any accusations that might be difficult to prove without solid evidence. He had assigned a trusted guard captain named Garrick to quietly investigate the circumstances surrounding Seraphine's death, reviewing old records, questioning servants who had worked in the palace during that time, searching for any detail that might confirm what the journal had only suggested. Elena continued her duties as healer, though her mind remained constantly occupied with the growing mystery unfolding around her. She had begun spending more of her free time in the palace's small library, searching through old records of physician visits, hoping to find something that might corroborate the suspicious nature of Seraphine's rapid decline. It was during one such evening, as she sat surrounded by dusty ledgers and faded documents, that Ashbourne found her, his expression tired but focused, carrying the weight of a man determined to see justice done, regardless of the personal cost. "Any progress?" he asked, taking a seat across from her at the small library table. "Some," Elena said, pushing a stack of papers toward him. "These are records of medicine deliveries to the palace during the months before Seraphine's death. Look at this entry here." She pointed to a specific line, her finger tracing beneath the faded ink. A large quantity of nightbloom root was delivered to the palace 3 weeks before she died, signed for by Lady Mirren personally. Ashbourne studied the entry carefully, his brow furrowing. "Nightbloom root. I'm not familiar with its uses." "It's rare, and dangerous in large doses," Elena explained. "In small amounts, it can be used to treat certain nerve conditions, but in larger quantities, especially when administered over time, it causes symptoms very similar to a natural wasting sickness. Exhaustion, loss of appetite, gradual weakening of the body's systems. It would be difficult to distinguish from genuine illness unless someone specifically knew what to look for. Ashbourne's hands tightened around the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white with barely restrained fury. You're saying Mirren poisoned her, slowly, deliberately, disguising it as illness. I can't say that with absolute certainty, Elena said carefully, though her own suspicions had grown considerably stronger with this discovery. But the timeline matches, and the symptoms described in the physician's notes align with what Nightbloom poisoning would produce. It's a very strong possibility, Ashbourne. He was silent for a long moment, staring down at the old records with an expression that seemed to be warring between grief and rage. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled, though Elena could hear the tremor of barely contained emotion beneath it. If this is true, if Mirren truly did this, then I have lived alongside my wife's murderer for 5 years, without ever suspecting a thing. I have trusted her, with the management of my household, with the care of my nephew, with countless decisions that affected this entire kingdom, all while she carried this secret within these very walls. We still need concrete proof before making any public accusations, Elena reminded him gently. A record of medicine delivery alone isn't enough to convict someone of murder, especially not someone with Mirren standing at court. We need something more definitive. Ashbourne nodded slowly, though the tension in his shoulders remained. Garrick's investigation may turn up additional evidence. In the meantime, we must be exceptionally careful. If Mirren suspects that we're close to uncovering the truth, there's no telling what she might do to protect herself. As if summoned by the mere mention of her name, a soft knock sounded at the library door, and both Elena and Ashbourne looked up sharply as Lady Mirren herself stepped into the room, her expression composed into its usual pleasant mask, though her eyes moved quickly between the two of them and the scattered papers on the table. Your Majesty, she said smoothly, offering a graceful bow. I apologize for interrupting. I was told you might be found here. Mirren, Ashbourne said, his voice carefully controlled, betraying none of the turmoil Elena knew must be churning beneath his composed exterior. What brings you to the library at this hour? A matter of household finances requires your attention, Your Majesty. The quarterly accounts need your signature before the end of the week. Mirren's eyes flicked toward the old ledgers spread across the table, and Elena noticed a slight tightening around her mouth, though whether from suspicion or mere curiosity, she couldn't be certain. You've been quite occupied with old records lately, I've noticed. Is there something particular you're researching? Simply reviewing some historical matters concerning the palace, Ashbourne said smoothly, his ability to mask his true feelings clearly well practiced from years of ruling a kingdom that demanded constant composure. Nothing that need concern you at present. Mirren's smile did not waver, but something calculating flickered behind her eyes as her gaze shifted briefly to Elena before returning to the king. Of course, Your Majesty. I only wished to ensure everything was in order. It's rare to see you spending so much time in quiet contemplation these days. I confess I've grown concerned about your well-being. Your concern is appreciated, though unnecessary, Ashbourne replied, his tone polite but firm, clearly signaling that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. I will review the financial accounts tomorrow morning. Thank you for bringing them to my attention. Mirren offered another graceful bow before departing, though Elena noticed the way her eyes lingered on the scattered papers one final time, before she disappeared through the doorway, her footsteps echoing softly down the corridor beyond. She suspects something, Elena said quietly, once they were alone again, her earlier confidence shaken by the encounter. Perhaps, Ashbourne acknowledged, his expression grim. We must move more carefully from here forward. I don't want to give her any reason to act rashly, not until we have enough evidence to ensure she faces proper justice for whatever she has done. Over the following days, Elena noticed a subtle but distinct shift in the atmosphere of the palace. Lady Mirren's polite composure remained outwardly unchanged, but there was a watchfulness to her now, a sharpness in her gaze whenever it fell upon Elena or the king, as though she were carefully calculating something behind her carefully maintained smile. Garrick's investigation continued quietly in the background, uncovering small additional pieces of evidence that, while not conclusive on their own, continued building toward a troubling pattern. A servant who had worked in the kitchens during Seraphine's final months came forward, hesitantly, to confirm that Lady Mirren had personally overseen the preparation of the Queen's evening tea during the weeks before her death, a task that had never previously fallen under her responsibilities. Another servant recalled overhearing a heated argument between Seraphine and Mirren shortly before the queen's health began declining, though the exact subject of the disagreement remained unclear, lost to years of faded memory and reluctance to speak openly about matters concerning the nobility. Elena found herself growing increasingly protective of the fragile trust that had developed between herself and Ashbourne during this difficult time. Their evening conversations continued, though now they carried an added weight, a shared purpose that bound them together beyond simple friendship or growing affection. They were partners now, in a sense, working together toward uncovering a truth that had remained buried for far too long. One evening, as they walked together through the quiet palace gardens, the autumn air crisp and cold around them, Ashbourne stopped suddenly, turning to face Elena with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something vulnerable beneath his usual composed exterior. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly, "and I need you to answer honestly, regardless of how the answer might affect anything between us." "Of course," Elena said, though a flutter of nervousness stirred in her chest at his serious tone. "When Mirren threatened you, weeks ago, warning you to keep your distance from me, did she ever explain why? Did she say anything that suggested she felt threatened by your presence here specifically?" Elena considered the memory carefully, recalling the exact words Mirren had used during that tense encounter in the palace corridor. She said that many women had believed they were different, that they might succeed where others failed, but that none of them lasted very long within these walls. She implied that something unfortunate might happen to me if I grew too close to you. Ashbourne's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his controlled expression. "She has done this before then, threatened others who showed interest in getting close to me." "I don't know for certain," Elena admitted, "but her words certainly suggested a pattern. Yes. Then we may not be dealing with a single act of jealousy that led to Seraphine's death," Ashbourne said slowly, the realization settling heavily over his features. "We may be dealing with someone who has spent years deliberately ensuring I remain isolated, unmarried, without anyone close enough to threaten whatever position or influence she has built for herself within this palace." The implication hung heavy in the cold evening air between them, and Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind. If Ashbourne's suspicions were correct, then Mirren's ambitions ran far deeper than simple jealousy over a lost romance. She had potentially spent 5 years actively cultivating the very fear and isolation that had come to define the king's reputation throughout the entire kingdom, using it as a shield to protect her own secrets, while simultaneously ensuring no one else could get close enough to uncover them. "Then we need to move quickly," Elena said firmly, "before she has the chance to do to me what she may have already done to Seraphine." Ashbourne's expression darkened with fierce protectiveness, his hand reaching out to gently cup Elena's face, his touch far gentler than his intense gaze suggested. "I will not allow that to happen," he said, his voice carrying a promise that resonated with quiet, dangerous conviction. "Whatever it takes, Elena, I will ensure your safety, even if it means confronting Mirren, before we have gathered every piece of evidence we might wish to possess." Elena leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his nearness, despite the danger gathering around them both. Whatever fear had once defined this palace, whatever darkness Mirren had spent years cultivating within these walls, Elena refused to let it consume the fragile hope that had begun growing between herself and the king, who everyone believed incapable of warmth. Neither of them noticed the faint movement of curtains in a nearby window, nor the cold, calculating eyes that watched their quiet exchange from the shadows, already beginning to formulate a plan to eliminate the growing threat that Elena Marsh had become to everything Lady Mirren had spent years so carefully protecting. Captain Garrick arrived at the king's private study late one evening, his expression grave as he closed the heavy wooden door behind him, ensuring their conversation would remain completely private. Elena had been present, as she often was now during these discussions, having become an integral part of the investigation despite the danger it placed her in. "I found the physician who originally treated Queen Seraphine during her final illness," Garrick reported, setting a small stack of papers on the desk before them. "He retired from royal service shortly after her death and now lives quietly in a village, 2 days' ride from the palace. It took considerable effort to track him down, but he agreed to speak with me once I explained the nature of my inquiry." "What did he tell you?" Ashbourne asked, leaning forward with intense focus. He confirmed that he always harbored doubts about the official diagnosis, though he never voiced them publicly at the time. He said the Queen's symptoms progressed in a manner inconsistent with any natural wasting sickness he had encountered before or since. He suspected poisoning even then, but Lady Mirren held considerable influence at court, and he feared the consequences of making such accusations without concrete proof. Ashbourne's hands clenched into fists atop the desk. Why did he never come forward with these suspicions? He said he was afraid, Your Majesty. Afraid of losing his position, afraid of what might happen to his family, should he accuse someone of Mirren's standing without absolute certainty. He carried that guilt for 5 years, he told me, wondering if his silence had allowed a murderer to escape justice. Elena watched the pain flash across Ashbourne's face, the weight of years of unwitting deception settling heavily upon him. Did he provide anything more concrete, something we could use as actual evidence rather than simply suspicion? Garrick nodded, pulling a folded document from within his coat. He kept detailed medical notes throughout the Queen's illness, notes he never submitted to the official palace records because he feared they might be altered or destroyed if his suspicions became known. He kept a private copy all these years, believing that someday the truth might need to come to light. Ashbourne took the document with trembling hands, unfolding it carefully to reveal pages of careful medical observations, dated and detailed, describing symptoms that aligned precisely with the night bloom poisoning Elena had suspected weeks earlier. The physician had even noted his suspicion directly within the private pages, writing that the pattern of decline seemed deliberately induced rather than naturally occurring. "This is enough," Ashbourne said quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous calm that Elena recognized now as the eye of a much larger storm building beneath his composed exterior. Combined with the journal, the delivery records, and the servants' testimonies, this gives us sufficient evidence to formally charge Mirren with Seraphine's murder. "There's something else, Your Majesty," Garrick added carefully. "The physician mentioned something during our conversation that troubled him deeply. He said that in the weeks before the Queen's death, he noticed Lady Mirren showing an unusual amount of interest in your personal well-being, asking pointed questions about your daily habits, your schedule, even your food preferences. At the time, he assumed it was simple concern for the royal family's welfare. Looking back now, he wonders if she was gathering information for other purposes." A cold silence fell over the room as the implications of this statement settled over everyone present. Elena felt her stomach twist with dread as she considered what Garrick's words might mean. "You believe she may have intended harm toward Ashbourne as well," Elena said slowly. "I don't know for certain," Garrick admitted, "but given everything else we've uncovered, it seems a possibility worth considering seriously." Ashbourne's expression had gone cold and distant, the fury from moments earlier settling into something far more dangerous, a controlled, calculating anger that Elena suspected was far more threatening than any outburst could ever be. If Mirren orchestrated Seraphine's death specifically to remove her as an obstacle, then it stands to reason she may have considered similar action against me, should I ever pose a threat to whatever position she sought to secure for herself. "Which means we need to move very carefully from this point forward," Elena said, her healer's instincts for caution overriding her own growing anger at the injustice they had uncovered. If she suspects we're closing in on proof, she may act rashly, out of desperation, rather than allowing herself to be caught. Ashbourne nodded slowly, though the tension in his jaw suggested every instinct within him wanted to confront Mirren immediately, to demand answers and justice without further delay. "Garrick, I want additional guards posted near Elena's quarters, and near my nephew's chambers as well. If Mirren feels cornered, she may lash out at those closest to me, in an attempt to protect herself, or exact some form of revenge." "Understood, Your Majesty. I'll see to it personally." As Garrick departed to arrange the additional security measures, Elena moved closer to Ashbourne, placing a comforting hand against his tense shoulder. "We're close now," she said softly. "Whatever happened, whatever she's done, the truth is finally coming to light, after 5 years of silence." "5 years," Ashbourne repeated, his voice heavy with grief and barely contained rage. 5 years I have grieved a woman whose death might have been prevented, had I paid closer attention, had I questioned the circumstances more thoroughly at the time. 5 years I have allowed her potential murderer to remain within these walls, trusted with responsibilities she never deserved. "You couldn't have known," Elena said gently. "Grief clouds judgment. Trust once given is difficult to question without concrete reason. You are not responsible for Mirren's actions, Ashbourne, only for how you choose to respond now that the truth has finally surfaced. He turned to look at her, something softening in his expression, despite the storm of emotions still visible beneath the surface. How is it that you understand exactly what I need to hear, every single time? Elena offered a small, tired smile. Perhaps because I've come to know you rather well these past weeks, or perhaps because I care deeply about easing whatever burden you carry, regardless of how heavy that burden might be. Ashbourne reached out, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering against her cheek longer than necessary. I find myself grateful, more than I can properly express, that fate brought you to this palace when it did, not simply for uncovering this truth, though that matters greatly, but for reminding me that warmth still exists within these walls, that connection remains possible, even after everything I believed I had lost forever. Elena's heart swelled at his words, the weight of the danger surrounding them, momentarily forgotten in the quiet intimacy of the study, illuminated only by the flickering candlelight and the soft glow of embers dying in the fireplace nearby. We should discuss our next steps carefully, Elena said reluctantly, forcing herself to focus despite the warmth spreading through her chest at his nearness. How do you intend to proceed with the evidence we've gathered? Ashbourne's expression grew serious once more, the king reasserting himself over the man momentarily lost in quiet affection. I will need to present this evidence formally before the court, ensuring proper procedure is followed, so that Mirren cannot claim any injustice in how the accusation was handled. This must be done carefully, methodically, to ensure justice is served completely, and that her influential allies among the nobility cannot dismiss the charges as baseless court politics. When will you confront her? Soon, Ashbourne said, his jaw tightening with renewed resolve. Within the coming days, once Garrick has finished securing additional protection for those closest to me, I want to ensure everyone's safety before taking any action that might provoke a desperate response from her. Elena nodded, understanding the wisdom in his careful approach, even as anxiety continued gnawing at her thoughts. They were close now, closer than they had been at any point during this investigation, but the closer they drew to the truth, the more dangerous their position became. Mirren was not a foolish woman. She had successfully hidden her crimes for 5 years, manipulating an entire kingdom's perception of their king, while quietly maintaining her position of influence and control. Someone that clever, that patient, would not simply allow herself to be caught without a fight. As the evening drew to a close, and Elena finally made her way back toward her own quarters, she could not shake the growing sense of unease settling over her, a feeling that the calm they had experienced these past few weeks was merely the quiet before a much larger storm, one that would test everything she and Ashbourne had built together, and everything the kingdom believed it understood about its feared and misunderstood king. 3 days passed with an uneasy calm settling over the palace, though beneath the surface, preparations continued quietly. Garrick had positioned additional guards throughout the palace grounds, disguising their increased presence as routine seasonal security measures to avoid alerting Mirren to the true purpose behind the changes. Elena continued her daily duties as healer, though she found it increasingly difficult to maintain a normal composure whenever Lady Mirren crossed her path. The noblewoman's watchful gaze seemed to follow her more intently now, a predatory awareness that made Elena's skin crawl each time their eyes met in passing. It was on the 4th evening, as Elena finished preparing evening remedies in her small workroom, that Ivy burst through the door, her face pale with barely controlled panic. "Elena, you need to come quickly. Something's happened to young Caden." Elena's heart dropped, her healer's instincts immediately overriding every other concern. "What happened?" "He collapsed during his evening lessons. The tutors sent for you immediately, but I thought you should know. Lady Mirren was the one who brought him his evening tea just before it happened." Ice ran through Elena's veins at Ivy's words. She grabbed her healer's satchel and rushed from the room, following Ivy through the palace corridors toward the young prince's chambers, her mind racing through every possible poison that might have been used, every antidote she might need to prepare. She found Caden lying on his bed, his breathing shallow and rapid, his skin unnaturally pale, sweat beading across his forehead despite the coolness of the room. 2 guards stood nearby, having already been summoned, along with a frantic tutor, who explained through broken sentences that the young prince had simply collapsed mid-lesson, complaining of dizziness moments before losing consciousness. Get me warm water and activated charcoal from my workroom immediately, Elena instructed one of the guards, who rushed off without hesitation. She knelt beside Caden, checking his pulse, examining his pupils, running through every diagnostic technique her mother had taught her over the years. His symptoms bore a troubling similarity to what she had read about nightbloom poisoning, though the reaction seemed far more immediate and severe than what had happened to Seraphine. Someone find the king immediately, Elena ordered, working quickly to stabilize the young boy's breathing, while they waited for the supplies she needed. He needs to know what's happened. Word reached Ashbourne within minutes, and he arrived at his nephew's chambers with a speed and intensity that sent servants scattering from his path. His face, upon seeing Caden's condition, transformed into something Elena had never witnessed before, a controlled fury so absolute, it seemed to radiate from him like heat from an open flame. "What happened to him?" Ashbourne demanded, kneeling beside the bed opposite Elena. "I believe he's been poisoned," Elena said grimly, continuing her work without pause. "The symptoms match what I would expect from a concentrated dose of something similar to nightbloom root, though the reaction is happening much faster than what occurred with Seraphine. Someone administered a far stronger dose this time." "Mirren," Ashbourne growled, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that promised severe consequences. "She brought him his tea before this happened," Elena confirmed, accepting the supplies the guard had brought and beginning to work quickly, inducing the boy to expel whatever poison remained in his system before it could cause further harm. "I don't yet know why she would target Caden specifically, but the timing cannot be coincidental." As Elena worked, fighting desperately to save the young prince's life, understanding began to dawn on Ashbourne's features, a horrible realization that made his expression darken even further. "She knows we suspect her," he said slowly. "She's grown desperate, and now she's trying to eliminate anyone who might stand between her and whatever she's protecting. Or perhaps she's simply trying to send a message, showing us exactly what she's capable of if we continue pursuing the truth." The next several hours passed in a blur of desperate effort as Elena worked to counter the effects of the poison coursing through Caden's small body. She administered charcoal to absorb whatever toxin remained in his system, kept him hydrated with careful sips of warm water, mixed with herbs known to support the body's natural healing processes, and monitored his vital signs constantly, watching for any sign of improvement, or, terrifyingly, further decline. Ashbourne remained at his nephew's bedside throughout the entire ordeal, his usual composed exterior completely abandoned in favor of raw, visible fear for the only family he had left. Elena had never seen him so vulnerable, so completely stripped of the careful control he maintained in every other aspect of his life. Just before dawn, Caden's breathing finally began to steady, his color slowly returning as the worst of the poison's effects passed through his system. Elena allowed herself a small, exhausted breath of relief, though she knew the boy would need careful monitoring over the coming days to ensure a full recovery. "He's going to be all right," she said softly, watching Ashbourne's shoulders sag with overwhelming relief at her words. The dose wasn't strong enough to cause permanent damage, thankfully, though it was certainly meant to do serious harm. Ashbourne reached out and gently took Elena's hand, his grip firm and grateful. "You saved him again. I don't know how I could ever properly thank you for what you've done for my family." "There's no need for thanks," Elena said gently. "But we need to act now, Ashbourne. Whatever calm approach we planned before, it's no longer safe to wait. Mirren has shown that she's willing to harm a child to protect her secrets. There's no telling what she might attempt next." Ashbourne's expression hardened with renewed resolve, the exhaustion and fear from the past several hours transforming into cold, determined purpose. "You're right. I will not wait any longer to confront her. Whatever evidence we have, whatever proof exists, it's enough. She will answer for what she's done, today." He rose from Caden's bedside, instructing Ivy to remain with the sleeping boy, while Elena helped him prepare for the confrontation that had been building for weeks. Garrick was summoned immediately, along with several trusted guards who had proven their loyalty throughout the quiet investigation. "I want Mirren brought before the court immediately," Ashbourne instructed, his voice carrying the full authority of a king who had finally reached the limits of his patience. "Formally, with witnesses present, so there can be no question of impropriety in how these charges are handled. And if she resists, Your Majesty?" Garrick asked carefully. "Then you have my full authority to detain her by whatever means necessary." "She poisoned my nephew last night," and I have every reason to believe she murdered my wife 5 years ago. I will not allow her to escape justice any longer, regardless of what political consequences might follow from her powerful allies at court. As preparations were made for the formal confrontation, Elena found herself standing beside Ashbourne in the quiet moments before everything would change irrevocably. She could see the weight of the coming hours already settling over him, the difficult balance between personal grief and public duty that came with wearing a crown. "Are you ready for this?" she asked softly. "I don't know if I will ever be fully ready to face the person who took Seraphine from me," Ashbourne admitted, his voice quiet but steady. "But I am ready to ensure that justice is finally served, that the truth is no longer buried beneath years of fear and silence. For Seraphine, for Caden, for every woman who has been made to fear me, because of secrets that were never mine to begin with, but rather secrets deliberately hidden to protect someone far more dangerous than the kingdom ever realized." Elena squeezed his hand gently, offering whatever comfort and strength she could provide in this difficult moment. "Whatever happens today, I'll be right beside you." Ashbourne looked at her with an expression that carried gratitude, affection, and quiet determination all at once. "I know," he said simply, before turning to lead the way toward the great hall, where Lady Mirren would soon learn that her carefully constructed web of lies had finally, completely, come undone. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over Blackmore Palace, casting long golden light across the courtyard, where guards were quietly gathering, preparing for whatever confrontation the coming hours might bring. Somewhere within the palace walls, unaware that her secrets were about to be exposed before the entire court, Lady Mirren continued her morning routine, entirely oblivious to the reckoning that awaited her. The great hall of Blackmore Palace had not seen a formal gathering of the court in months, and word spread quickly through the palace that morning that the king had summoned every member of the nobility currently in residence for an urgent matter. Whispers filled the corridors as courtiers hurried to dress appropriately, speculation running wild about what could possibly warrant such an unusual and immediate gathering. Elena stood near the edge of the great hall, positioned close enough to Ashbourne's throne to offer support should he need it, though far enough back to allow the formal proceedings to unfold according to proper court protocol. Garrick stood at attention nearby, along with several other trusted guards, their expressions carefully neutral despite the tension evident in their rigid posture. Lady Mirren arrived precisely on time, dressed in an elegant gown of deep burgundy, her composure as flawless as ever despite whatever uncertainty she might have felt about the sudden summons. She moved through the gathered crowd with practiced grace, offering polite nods to familiar faces, though Elena noticed the slight tightness around her eyes, the barely perceptible tension in her shoulders that suggested she was not entirely at ease. "Your Majesty," Mirren said, offering a graceful bow as she approached the throne. "You honor me with this summons. How may I be of service?" Ashbourne's expression remained carefully controlled, though Elena could see the barely contained fury simmering just beneath the surface of his composed exterior. "Lady Mirren, you stand accused of the murder of Queen Seraphine, and of the attempted poisoning of my nephew, Prince Caden, which occurred just last night." A collective gasp echoed through the great hall, courtiers exchanging shocked glances as whispers erupted throughout the assembled crowd. Mirren's face, for just a moment, betrayed genuine surprise, quickly masked beneath an expression of wounded innocence. "Your Majesty, these are grave accusations indeed. I cannot imagine what evidence could possibly support such claims against someone who has served this household faithfully for years." "We have considerable evidence," Ashbourne said coldly, nodding toward Garrick, who stepped forward, carrying the collected documents they had gathered over the past weeks. "Records showing you personally received a shipment of Nightbloom root 3 weeks before Seraphine's death. Medical notes from her physician, kept privately for years out of fear, documenting symptoms consistent with poisoning rather than natural illness. Testimony from servants confirming you personally oversaw preparation of the Queen's tea during her final weeks, a task that had never before fallen under your responsibilities. And now, an attack on my nephew, using what appears to be a similar poison, occurring immediately after preparations began to formally investigate these very matters." Mirren's composed mask flickered, just slightly, before she regained control of her expression. "Your Majesty, I understand your grief over losing Seraphine has clearly never fully healed, but surely you can see how circumstantial such evidence appears. Nightbloom root has legitimate medicinal uses. Servants misremember details after years have passed. And as for young Caden's illness, I had no involvement whatsoever in whatever happened to him. You brought him his evening tea yourself, just hours before he collapsed, Elena said, stepping forward despite the breach of protocol, unable to remain silent while Mirren attempted to deflect such serious accusations. The kitchen staff confirmed it. You've never personally delivered his meals before. Mirren's eyes turned toward Elena, cold and sharp, despite the polite smile still fixed upon her face. Ah, the healer's daughter. I should have known you would be involved in stirring up such baseless accusations. Tell me, Elena Marsh, what exactly do you hope to gain by inserting yourself so thoroughly into matters that have nothing to do with you? Justice for a murdered queen. Elena replied evenly, refusing to be intimidated despite the danger radiating from the woman before her, and protection for a child who nearly died last night because of your actions. The great hall had grown deathly silent, every courtier present hanging on each word exchanged between the accuser and the accused. Ashbourne rose from his throne, his presence commanding immediate attention as he descended the steps to stand closer to Mirren, his expression carrying a weight of 5 years of grief finally given voice. I trusted you, he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly throughout the silent hall. I trusted you with my household, with my nephew's care, with countless decisions affecting this kingdom, all while you carried this secret within these very walls. Why, Mirren? Why would you do this to Seraphine? To me? What could possibly justify such betrayal? For a long moment, Mirren said nothing, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of Ashbourne's direct question and the overwhelming evidence laid bare before the entire court. Then, slowly, something shifted in her expression, the polite mask falling away, to reveal something far colder, far more bitter than anyone had previously glimpsed. You want to know why? She said, her voice suddenly sharp, stripped of its usual honeyed politeness. Because I loved you first, Ashbourne. Long before Seraphine ever arrived at this palace. Long before her family's alliance made her the obvious choice for your bride. I had already given my heart to you. I watched you choose her instead. Watched you fall in love with someone who had done nothing to earn that devotion, beyond the fortunate circumstances of her birth, while I remained invisible, forgotten, expected to simply accept whatever role you assigned me within this household. The confession hung heavy in the stunned silence of the great hall, courtiers exchanging horrified glances, as the truth finally emerged after years of careful concealment. So you murdered her, Ashbourne said, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. You murdered an innocent woman, because you couldn't accept that I never returned your feelings. Innocent, Mirren repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. She was never innocent, Ashbourne. She took everything that should have been mine. And even after she was gone, even after I finally had the chance to be close to you again, to slowly rebuild what we might have had together, you remained distant, grieving a woman who never deserved your devotion in the first place. I waited 5 years, Ashbourne, 5 years of careful patience, believing eventually you would see me, truly see me, once enough time had passed. But instead, you brought this village healer into our home, and within weeks, you looked at her the way you once looked at Seraphine, the way you never once looked at me. So you tried to poison Caden, Elena said, horror dawning as she pieced together Mirren's twisted logic. Not to protect a secret, but out of jealousy. Because you saw him as evidence of Ashbourne's growing attachment to someone else, someone who had earned genuine affection from him within weeks, something you never managed to achieve in years. Mirren's eyes flashed with fury at Elena's words, the last vestiges of her careful composure crumbling entirely. You don't understand anything, healer's daughter. You think you're special, that whatever connection you've built with him in these few short weeks means something lasting, something real. But you'll end up exactly like Seraphine, forgotten and gone, the moment you become inconvenient. Guards, seize her, Ashbourne commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority, despite the emotional weight of everything that had just been revealed. Lady Mirren will be held in the palace dungeons until a full trial can be conducted before the entire court, with all evidence properly presented and examined. Garrick and several other guards moved forward immediately, restraining Mirren despite her attempts to resist, her composed elegance completely abandoned now in favor of desperate, furious struggling. As she was led from the great hall, her eyes remained fixed on Elena with an expression of pure, undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," Mirren spat, as guards pulled her toward the exit. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've truly started." The threat lingered in the air, long after Mirren had been removed from the hall, and Elena felt a chill run through her, despite the victory of finally exposing the truth, after years of careful concealment. Ashbourne moved to stand beside her, his expression a complicated mixture of relief, grief, and lingering anger at everything that had finally come to light. "It's over now," he said quietly, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that suggested he too had heard the dangerous promise hidden within Mirren's parting words. "Is it?" Elena asked softly, watching the doorway through which Mirren had disappeared, a nagging unease settling over her despite the justice they had finally achieved. "She has allies at court, Ashbourne, powerful ones," and her final words sounded less like the ravings of someone defeated and more like a warning of something still to come. Ashbourne's jaw tightened as he considered her words, the weight of the coming trial, and whatever consequences might yet follow from finally exposing a truth that had remained buried for 5 long years, still hanging heavy over everything they had accomplished this morning. The days following Mirren's arrest brought a strange mixture of relief and lingering tension throughout Blackmore Palace. News of her confession spread quickly through the kingdom, carried by traveling merchants and messengers to every corner of the land, and for the first time in 5 years, the whispers surrounding the king began to shift in tone, from fearful speculation about his supposed involvement in Seraphine's death to genuine sympathy for a man who had been deceived and manipulated by someone he had trusted completely. Elena continued her duties as healer, though her days now carried an added purpose beyond simple medical care. She spent considerable time with Caden, ensuring his full recovery from the poisoning, watching with quiet joy as the young prince's energy and curiosity gradually returned to their usual vibrant levels. "Will Lady Mirren go to prison forever?" Caden asked one afternoon, as Elena checked his pulse during a routine visit. "That will be for the court to decide during her formal trial," Elena said gently. "But she will face serious consequences for what she's done, yes." "Good," Caden said with the blunt honesty children so often possessed. "She hurt my Aunt Seraphine, and she tried to hurt me too. She shouldn't get to just walk away from that." Elena couldn't help but smile at the boy's straightforward sense of justice, so uncomplicated compared to the political considerations weighing on Ashbourne as he prepared for the formal trial that would determine Mirren's ultimate fate. The preparations for the trial proved more complicated than anyone had initially anticipated. Mirren's family, powerful nobles from a neighboring territory, had sent representatives to the palace, demanding assurances that their daughter would receive fair treatment despite her confession. Whispers circulated among certain factions of the court, suggesting that political pressure might be applied to reduce whatever punishment the court eventually decided upon, a possibility that filled Elena with quiet dread whenever she considered it. "They cannot simply erase what she's done because of political connections," Elena said one evening, pacing anxiously within Ashbourne's private study as they discussed the mounting complications surrounding the upcoming trial. "I know," Ashbourne said wearily, rubbing his temples as the weight of ruling a kingdom while personally grieving continued to take its toll. "But politics rarely align perfectly with justice, Elena. Mirren's family holds considerable influence, control over resources this kingdom depends upon during difficult seasons. I must balance the demands of justice against the broader stability of the realm, however uncomfortable that balance may feel. She poisoned a child, Ashbourne. She murdered your wife. Surely that outweighs any political consideration." "It does, in my heart," Ashbourne said quietly. "But a king cannot always rule solely by what his heart demands. There are considerations beyond personal justice that I must weigh carefully." Elena understood the difficult position he found himself in, though frustration still simmered within her at the thought that Mirren's powerful connections might somehow shield her from the full consequences of her actions. She trusted Ashbourne's judgment, however, recognizing that ruling a kingdom required navigating complexities far beyond what she, as a village healer, had ever needed to consider in her previous life. The formal trial began a week later, conducted before the full assembly of the court, with every piece of evidence they had gathered presented meticulously for examination. The physician who had originally treated Seraphine traveled back to the palace to testify in person, his private medical notes serving as crucial evidence that could not be easily dismissed or explained away. Servants who had witnessed various suspicious details over the years found renewed courage, testifying openly now that Miran no longer held any power over their livelihoods or safety. Miran herself sat through the proceedings with a cold, defiant expression, occasionally interjecting to dispute specific details, though her earlier confession before the entire court left little room for genuine denial of her fundamental guilt. Her family's representatives argued passionately for leniency, citing her previous years of service to the crown, suggesting that perhaps some form of exile rather than imprisonment might serve justice while preserving important political relationships between the territories. Elena watched the proceedings with growing anxiety, uncertain how the balance of justice and politics would ultimately resolve. She glanced frequently toward Ashbourne, seated upon his throne throughout the trial, his expression carefully neutral despite the personal weight every testimony must have carried for him. On the final day of proceedings, after all evidence had been presented and all testimonies heard, Ashbourne rose to deliver his judgment, the great hall falling into complete silence as everyone awaited his decision. "Lady Miran," he began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the hall, steady, despite the emotion Elena knew must be churning beneath his composed exterior. "You have confessed, before this entire court, to the murder of Queen Seraphine, and to the attempted poisoning of Prince Caden. The evidence presented throughout this trial has confirmed these confessions beyond reasonable doubt." Miran remained silent, her expression unreadable as she awaited his final decision. "Your family requests leniency, citing years of service to this household. I acknowledge that service, though it has been irrevocably tainted by your later actions. However, murder of a member of the royal family, and the attempted murder of a child, cannot simply be excused through political consideration or previous loyalty. Justice demands consequences proportional to the severity of your crimes." Ashbourne paused, his eyes moving briefly to Elena before returning to Miran, his expression hardening with final resolve. "You will be stripped of your title and all noble privileges. You will be imprisoned within Blackmoor's most secure facility for the remainder of your natural life, with no possibility of pardon or reduced sentence. Your family's political relationship with this kingdom will remain intact, as they bear no responsibility for your individual actions, but you personally will face the full consequences of the crimes you have committed." A murmur swept through the assembled court at this decision, some expressing quiet approval, others exchanging glances, suggesting they had hoped for a different outcome, given the political complexities involved. Miran's expression finally cracked, genuine fear breaking through her carefully maintained composure, as guards moved forward to escort her from the great hall toward the prison that would become her permanent residence. As she was led away, she turned one final time toward Elena, her expression twisted with bitter hatred, despite the fear now evident beneath it. "You still don't understand what you've done," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite the guards pulling her toward the exit. "You think you've secured happiness for yourself, but you'll learn, eventually, that loving a king comes with burdens you cannot possibly imagine. The crown demands sacrifice, Elena Marsh. It always has, and it always will." The words lingered in the air long after Miran had disappeared from the great hall, and Elena felt a chill despite the justice that had finally been served. She glanced toward Ashbourne, finding him watching her with an expression of concern, as if he too worried about the truth hidden within Miran's parting warning. That evening, as the palace slowly settled back into its normal rhythms following the conclusion of the trial, Elena found herself walking alone through the quiet gardens, processing everything that had unfolded over the past several weeks. The fear that had once defined her understanding of this palace, of its king, had transformed entirely into something far more complicated, far more meaningful than she could have ever anticipated when she first arrived here to deliver medicine for her aunt. She heard footsteps approaching, and turned to find Ashbourne walking toward her, his expression softer now than it had appeared throughout the tense proceedings of the trial, though shadows of exhaustion remained visible beneath his eyes. "It's finally over," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her near the garden's small fountain, its gentle sound providing a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. 5 years of unanswered questions, of unexplained grief, finally resolved. "How do you feel?" Elena asked gently. Ashbourne considered the question carefully before answering, his gaze drifting toward the darkening evening sky above them. "Relieved, in some ways. Justice has finally been served for Seraphine, and my nephew is safe. But there's also a strange emptiness, knowing that the mystery that has shaped so much of my life these past 5 years is now resolved. I'm uncertain what comes next, having spent so long focused entirely on uncovering this particular truth. Elena reached out, gently taking his hand in hers, offering silent comfort and support. Perhaps what comes next is simply learning to live again, without the weight of unanswered questions holding you back. Ashbourne turned to look at her, something warm and hopeful replacing the exhaustion in his eyes. I would like that very much, Elena, but I find I don't wish to face whatever comes next alone. The implication behind his words hung gently in the evening air between them, and Elena felt her heart swell with an emotion she had been reluctant to fully acknowledge throughout these past weeks of danger and uncertainty. Whatever fear had once surrounded this palace, whatever darkness had defined its king's reputation throughout the kingdom, both had finally been laid to rest, replaced by the quiet promise of something new, beginning to bloom between them, however uncertain the path ahead might still remain. Winter arrived at Blackmore Palace, with its usual quiet beauty, snow blanketing the courtyard where autumn leaves had fallen just weeks before, transforming the grounds into a peaceful landscape of white and silver. Elena had continued her work at the palace, even after the royal healer finally returned from his extended travels, Ashbourne having offered her a permanent position as the household's secondary healer, an offer she had accepted without hesitation, no longer feeling any pull toward returning to her old life in the village, not when everything she had come to care about most now resided within these palace walls. News of Mirren's trial and conviction had spread throughout the kingdom over the following months, and slowly, gradually, the fear that had once surrounded Ashbourne's reputation began to transform into something entirely different. Stories now circulated of a king who had personally investigated his wife's murder, who had shown mercy and fairness, even while delivering justice to someone who had betrayed his trust so completely, who had raised an orphan nephew with genuine love and care, despite the demands of ruling an entire kingdom. Women who had once whispered warnings to their daughters about avoiding the Alpha King now spoke differently, sharing stories of his quiet kindness, his fierce protectiveness toward those he cared about, his willingness to seek truth, even when that truth threatened to shatter everything he thought he understood about his own household. The old fear had not entirely disappeared, but it had softened considerably, replaced by a growing respect and, in many cases, genuine warmth toward a ruler who had proven himself far more complex and compassionate than years of rumor had ever suggested. Elena often found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that first terrifying night, when she had rushed into the palace hallway to save a dying child, uncertain whether she would survive her encounter with the man everyone feared. Now, months later, she could hardly recognize the anxious healer who had once trembled at the mere thought of catching the king's attention. "You seem lost in thought," Ashbourne said one evening, finding her seated near the fireplace in his private study, a book resting forgotten in her lap as she stared into the dancing flames. "Just reflecting on everything that's happened since I first arrived here," Elena said, offering him a warm smile as he settled into the chair beside her. "It feels like a lifetime ago, though it's been less than a year." "A great deal has changed," Ashbourne agreed, reaching over to take her hand in his, a gesture that had become comfortably familiar between them over these past months. "For the better, I hope you would agree." "Without question," Elena said softly, squeezing his hand affectionately. Their relationship had deepened steadily throughout the winter months, growing from the tentative friendship and shared purpose that had first brought them together into something far more profound. Ashbourne had grown more open with her than Elena suspected he had been with anyone since Seraphine's death, sharing memories of his childhood, his fears about ruling a kingdom that had suffered years of uncertainty due to his own isolation, his hopes for what the future might hold, now that the darkness surrounding Seraphine's death had finally been resolved. Caden, too, had grown remarkably close to Elena over these months, often seeking her out for company during his free hours, treating her with the easy affection of a child who had found someone new to trust and care for within his small family circle. Elena had come to love the boy dearly, finding herself deeply invested in his continued happiness and well-being alongside her growing feelings for his uncle. It was on a particularly cold evening in late winter, as snow continued falling steadily outside the palace windows, that Ashbourne led Elena toward the same balcony where they had first shared Seraphine's journal months earlier, the place where their careful investigation into the past had first begun to transform into something deeper between them. "Do you remember this place?" Ashbourne asked, standing beside her, as they looked out over the snow-covered gardens below. "Of course," Elena said softly. "This is where you first told me about Seraphine's anniversary, where everything between us truly began to change." Ashbourne nodded, his expression thoughtful, as he turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "I have thought carefully about what I wish to say to you, Elena, though I confess, these words do not come as easily to me as I might wish, given how much practice I've had at maintaining careful composure throughout most situations in my life." Elena's heart began to race, sensing the significance building within this moment, though she remained quiet, allowing him space to gather his thoughts. "When you first arrived at this palace, I was a man defined entirely by fear and isolation, carrying grief I had never properly processed, surrounded by an entire kingdom that believed the worst about me, without ever truly understanding the truth. You changed that, Elena. Not simply by helping me uncover what had happened to Seraphine, though I will always be grateful for the justice you helped bring to her memory. You changed everything by reminding me that connection, that warmth, that genuine love remained possible, even after everything I believed I had permanently lost." He reached into his coat, producing a small velvet box that made Elena's breath catch immediately, understanding instantly what this moment represented. "I know this may seem sudden to some, given the tragedy that colored so much of my past, but I have never been more certain of anything than I am of my feelings for you, Elena Marsh. You walked into this palace when every woman in this kingdom feared to even approach these gates, and you refused to let that fear define how you treated me. You saw past the rumors, past the isolation I had built around myself, and you found the truth of who I truly was, even when I struggled to remember that truth myself." Elena's eyes filled with tears as Ashbourne knelt before her, opening the small box to reveal a beautiful ring, and simple but elegant, catching the soft glow of candlelight from the room behind them. "Elena Marsh, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, my queen, and my partner in ruling this kingdom for the rest of our lives together?" "Yes," Elena said immediately, without a moment's hesitation, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks, as Ashbourne rose to slip the ring onto her finger, before pulling her into a warm, tender embrace. "Yes, Ashbourne. 1,000 times yes." Their engagement was announced throughout the kingdom within days, and the response from the people proved overwhelming in its warmth and support. The story of how Elena had first saved young Caden's life, how she had helped uncover the truth behind Seraphine's tragic death, how she had refused to let fear define her interactions with a king everyone else had avoided, spread quickly throughout every corner of the realm, inspiring countless retellings that only grew more romantic and hopeful with each new telling. Their wedding took place in early spring, as the first flowers began blooming throughout the palace gardens, transforming the grounds into a celebration of color and life after the long, quiet months of winter. The entire kingdom seemed to celebrate alongside them, villages hosting their own smaller festivities in honor of their beloved king, finally finding happiness after years of unexplained isolation. Elena stood before the assembled court on her wedding day, dressed in flowing white fabric that seemed to catch the spring sunlight streaming through the great hall's windows, watching Ashbourne's face as she walked toward him, his expression carrying a warmth and open joy that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him during those years of quiet grief and careful isolation. "I love you," he whispered as she reached him, taking her hands in his, before the entire assembled court. "I love you too," Elena replied softly, her heart overflowing with a happiness she could never have anticipated when she first nervously entered these palace gates all those months ago. As their wedding ceremony concluded and the kingdom erupted into joyful celebration, Elena caught sight of Caden standing nearby, beaming with genuine happiness as he watched his uncle and his new aunt embrace before the cheering crowd. The boy who had once told her that everyone whispered fearful rumors about his uncle, instead of simply asking him directly, now watched a kingdom celebrate the truth, finally freed from years of unfounded fear and misunderstanding. The old stories about the Alpha King, the whispered warnings that had once kept every woman in the kingdom at a careful distance, had finally been replaced by a new story entirely, one of justice found after years of patient searching, of love discovered in the most unexpected circumstances, and of a healer's daughter who had walked fearlessly into a palace everyone believed dangerous, only to find that true danger had been hiding in someone else entirely. someone who had spent years manipulating an entire kingdom's perception through calculated fear and careful deception. Elena Marsh, once an ordinary village healer with no expectations beyond helping her community survive another difficult season, had become the queen who changed everything, who proved that courage and compassion could overcome even the deepest, most carefully constructed fears, and who found, in the most unlikely of circumstances, a love that would carry both herself and her new husband forward into a future finally free from the shadows that had darkened Blackmore Palace for far too long. As spring continued blossoming across the kingdom, bringing new life and renewed hope to a land that had endured years of quiet uncertainty, Elena stood beside her husband on the very balcony where their story had first begun to change, watching the sun set over gardens now blooming with color, grateful beyond words for the unexpected path that had led her to this moment, to this love, and to a future she intended to build with unwavering courage and open-hearted devotion for the rest of her days.